I'm going to go over a concept that's pretty important for you AP Computer Science A students, and that's something known as looping. Now, looping or loops are very useful in Java because they can help us execute a line or lines of code multiple times without us having to physically write out that line of code over and over. Let me give you an example. So let's say your teacher says, I want you to print out every single number from 1 to 100. And you might be thinking, well, that's going to take a long time. You know, I have to print out each number individually. So you go, okay, so let me go system.out.print, and then I go 1, system.out.print, and then I go 2, and so on and so forth. But that's really inefficient. But with a loop, we can do basically all of this in 2 lines of code instead of 100. So within loops, there are 2 main different types of loops, and one kind is a for loop, and the other kind is a while loop. And the main difference is for loops, they basically run on a counter variable. And if you don't, and a counter variable just basically means a variable that's updated each time the loop runs. So this runs on a counter. And while loops, they are condition based. So hopefully by now you've gone over conditional statements and those make sense to you. If they don't make sense to you, I highly suggest watching our video on conditional statements, and I'll link that in the description. But while loops, they run on they're conditional. So back to for loops, what I mean by a counter is that, let's say I have my loop here, and then I have some lines of code here. And let's say I want to run these lines of code 6 times. Well, each time I go through, let's say my counter variable is named x. Each time I go through, x is going to be increased by 1. So I'm going to do x plus 1 each time I go through. So after one loop, some people also call it one iteration, I'm going to increase my counter variable by 1. And for now, I'm not going to write any real code. I'm just going to sort of draw out these situations so that we can sort of grasp the concept of looping. And then later in the video, I'm going to show you how to actually code these loops. Now onto while loops. So in if condition, you would have the word if, or else if, or else. And then you have your parentheses. Then you'd have your condition here, and then you would have whatever code is under here, right? Well, while loops are similar. So a while loop, unlike a for loop runs a certain amount of times. But a while loop, it won't run unless the condition that's inside of its brackets is met. So let's say I'll write while, and then I'll write the brackets, like I do with an if condition. Inside of here, whatever's in here has to be true in order for any of this code that's over here to run. Because as soon as this statement right here is not true, that means that none of this over here is going to run. So while loops are condition based, and for loops are based on a counter. So hopefully that's a good introduction for you guys. So now I'm going to go into actually how to code these loops. Now that I'm inside of Replit, I can actually demonstrate to you guys what for loops and while loops look like while we actually code them. So let's take the example we were doing before, and we want to print all numbers from 1 to 100. So for this example, I'm going to use a for loop. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to go for, and then I'm going to do my parentheses. And then I'm going to do int, and then usually you could use any letter or name here, let's say I'm going to use I for this example. So for int I, and I want to start it at, I want to start counting from 1. So I'm going to say int I equals 1. Then I'm going to do a semicolon. I is less than, I'm going to say less than 101. Why did I do 101? Because when we write for loops, the last number is not going to be actually counted, I++. And what I++ basically means, so if I do I++, that is the same thing as saying I equals I plus 1. Then I'm going to use my brackets. And then with inside of here, I'm going to use my print. So system.out.println. And then I'm going to just put I in here, and then I'm going to do that. So now, once I run this for loop, it should print all numbers from 1 to 100. And as you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, and then we stop at 100. Now, what if I wanted 101 to be included? Or let's say I didn't want to use 101, I wanted to use 100. Well, we can still do that, but we have to put less than or equal to. So let me run that again, and we should get the same result. Second. As you can see, we go up to 100 again. So that's how you use a for loop. So a for loop can be broken down into at least this part of the for loop when you write it can be broken down into 3 parts. This is your start. So this is where you're going to start. Remember that you have to specify that this is an integer right here when you're doing this. This is going to be sort of like your range, what you're going up to. So this is going to be your start, and this is going to be your end, okay? And then this is going to be what you're sort of incrementing by, or what you're counting by. So let's say I just wanted to count I wanted to count by 2's until 100. I plus equal 2. What I plus equal 2 does is I plus equal 2 is the same thing as saying I equals I plus 2. Okay, and then I can start this from 0. And then what would happen is it should print 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and so on, all the way up to 100. So I've just printed all my even numbers from 0 to 100. Now, I've talked about for loops, but there's also another kind of loop, and that's while loops. So I can write the word while, and let's say while x is less than 100. Remember, this is our condition right here. So we can do while x is less than 100, print system.out.print x. Now, this, you might think this will work, which it won't. So let me just show you. I'm going to run it. And yes, we get an error because the computer can, when it says cannot find symbol, it means basically you haven't declared x as a variable. And that's because in the for loop, you might be wondering, oh, why outside of here, why didn't we just write int I equals 0 or something like that? Well, it's because within a for loop, we're already declaring our variable right there. Here, in a while loop, you have to declare your variable outside of your while loop. So we'll do something like int x equals 0 outside of here. So now that we have x starting at 0, while x is less than 100, so remember, this loop is going to keep going over and over and over until this condition is not met anymore. And we saw how we were incrementing. So originally we were doing I++, but in this case, nothing is going to happen here. This is just going to go on forever. So if I run this, it's just going to keep printing x over and over and over and I'll explain why in a second. So it's just continuously printing 0 over and over. It's not stopping. So let me just stop this real quick. So let it stop for a second. But why is that? Well, x is equal to 0, but x is always going to be less than 100 because nothing's happening to x. X is just staying at 0, and 0 will always be less than 100. So that means that the code inside of here is going to keep running because this condition will always be met. So for our step size or our increment for while loops, we have to put that inside of our loop. So we do x plus plus inside here. So now if I run this, this should print every number from 0 to 99. So remember, I'm going to have to put an equal sign here if I want it to go to 100. And just let it run. Okay, so that's our first 100 from the for loop. Now we start going at the while loop. As you can see, we're going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and all the way up to 100. So that's essentially how you can use for loops and while loops to write certain lines of code. You can write a line of code once, and it will perform that line of code over and over. So hopefully this was like a solid introduction to loops, and please consider subscribing.